So let's talk about implementation of this IP strategy. So at this point in time, a high growth company is gone and they've built their own IP strategy, which means that they have a human resource and an offshore company performing the critical functions to create IP. And they proudly show it to us. What's your response?
Implementation is the most important part of this process. And what we really tried to do is record that implementation process in a very clear and identifiable way. And what we look at is who the people are that are in the offshore jurisdiction that are performing these functions, and how those dial back into the framework of creative, strategic, commercial, maintenance, and enhancement. And what they are doing and what the features that they are creating over the course of that process.
So it sounds like you're taking the IP strategy and plugging it into an IP roadmap.
Yes.
Okay. So what's the ideal outcome of a process of implementing and recording implementing?
Well, ideally, we would be able to give you a verified blue tick to state that all of these functions from our perspective have been fulfilled to the book, and all of the features which have been created as a result of properly fulfilling those functions are legitimately owned by the offshore entity.
Great. So it sounds like a story of credibility. We're not trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes. We're showing how the authentic implementation of your IP strategy can create IP offshore by backtracking into the evidence of who's actually offshore doing what and where. So this obviously doesn't happen overnight. IP doesn't get created in the matter of days. How does this look like in your experience from a process perspective?
This is not a overnight project. This is something that happens over time, and it's a legitimate creation of new IP offshore. What we're doing here is not moving IP, and we're not exporting intellectual property and value from South Africa and placing it somewhere else. What we're really doing is identifying the intellectual property that currently exists in South Africa, and then we're tracking what new IP is created offshore. And over the course of time, which is generally a year to 2 years, potentially more depending on how big the existing IP base is, we start to track the creation of new intellectual property offshore. And what that does is, as it creates a new value, old features become redundant. And that value shift is where it becomes really interesting, because over time, from a group perspective, the group grows in value, and it enables the offshore company to really fund a thriving operational business in South Africa. But what it doesn't do is move IP offshore. It does, however, reduce the IP value base in South Africa and grows that value offshore.
Tim, what kind of South African company would be most interested in creating an IP strategy for themselves and implementing it in the way you describe?
The kind of companies that this is most valuable for are high growth tech companies who have already established themselves as powerful companies in the South African market. But they reach a point where they have a ceiling in South Africa and they want to take on a global market. At that point in time, they need to figure out a way to access that global market, which generally requires a lot of investment.
Sounds like a lot of that investment is offshore. But why do they need an IP strategy to access that investment?
Well, they need an IP strategy to access that investment because most investors are only interested in investing in companies whose IP is situated in the offshore jurisdiction. So that's where the IP strategy comes in, where we are able to assist clients and companies by creating legitimately valuable IP in the offshore jurisdiction.
Ticking the box, the investor who wants to put cash into a company that's offshore, but that company owns that heartbeat of IP. Exactly. And this is what the IP strategy achieves. Okay. Who else would be interested in seeing that an IP strategy is being properly implemented?
Well, we've already dealt with the first. Any investor who is investing money into a group will want to know that a company is properly fulfilling the relevant functions in order to create the intellectual property offshore.
Fine, tick that box. Who else?
The other is obviously the South African Reserve Bank.
Why is that?
SARS and SARB will want to be clear on the fact that there is no intangible intellectual property that is being offshored. Basically, they want to know that you are not moving capital out of the South African tax base into another jurisdiction.
You mentioned capital there, and intellectual property is capital as defined by exchange controls and the tax base. So why don't they want capital to move offshore?
Well, as long as that capital remains in South Africa, they're able to tax the return on that capital. So as it's pushing more and more revenue, they are able to tax that revenue.
Wow, so what we're doing here is quite dramatic. We're actually creating IP or capital which could earn revenue that wouldn't be taxable in South Africa.
Precisely.
So if a company does its job properly and it creates its IP strategy and it creates its evidence trail of actually being implemented, what you're saying is that that's an answer to Saab or SARS, who might allege that this IP is actually created in South Africa and whose revenue might be taxed here.
That's exactly what we're doing.
Great. Well, that's quite a project. Thanks, Tim.